I have not been able to deliver Brexit. So I am today announcing that I will resign as leader of the Conservative and Unionist Party on Friday the 7th of June.
Well, time has finally caught up with Theresa May, now in her final week as leader of her party. Some people say she was Britain's worst Prime Minister ever. Really, though? Worse than these gentlemen? We're going to be taking a look at her record, compare it with theirs. We'll also try to figure out who will replace her in a few weeks' time. They say the blonde bombshell's the favourite, and after all that, we'll have to have a tea break in the PM's birthplace. What do people there think of Mrs May being brought to tears by Brexit? But first, how Brexit killed the PM's career.
I will shortly leave the job that it has been the honour of my life to hold. I do so with no ill will, but with enormous and enduring gratitude to have had the opportunity to serve the country I love. As we leave the European Union, we will forge a bold, new, positive role for ourselves in the world.
It is the worst set of circumstances to inherit on coming into number 10.
And of course she did vote to stay in the EU.
I would have preferred, of course, for there to have been someone who favoured Brexit, but I am reassured in her speeches and her media comments that for her Brexit means
Brexit. I've called an election because of Brexit. We've got to get this right.
Conservatives were ahead on all the main issues, they were ahead on leadership, they were ahead on competence, and yet they seem to have lost their majority.
In terms of the Brexit negotiations, it means her own position is very constrained.
I don't think this is going to help our negotiations in Brussels, and I don't think it's going to be easy to move forward from this.
We can choose to leave with no deal, or we can choose to unite and support the best deal that can be negotiated. This deal.
We're on the verge of making a historic mistake.
Ordinary, normal people, they know it was a rubbish, rotten deal.
This is not Brexit. This is a failure of government policy. It needs to be rejected.
This deal now has to change. There has to be an alternative found. And if the Prime Minister can't accept that, then she must go, not at an indeterminate date in the future, but now.
I have done everything I can to convince MPs to back that deal. Sadly, I have not been able to do so.
Well, she's gone. She resigns. It is an historic day. Theresa May has resigned on the steps of Downing Street within the past few minutes.
It is and will always remain a matter of deep regret to me that I have not been able to deliver Brexit.
Well, who'd want to take on that poison chalice that is Brexit? Believe it or not, close to a dozen people, wannabes, lining up to take a sip. And we're going to talk about them later. But first, let's bring in our guest. Up there in the top left, the Conservative journalist, Andre Walker. To the right there, we have Professor Scott Lucas, an American academic who's been living in Britain for some 35 years now. And down at the bottom, we've got Alan Wager, a British academic who's with an independent think tank. Alan, may I start with you? As a lot of people would say she was dealt a bad hand, but she played it badly. Others would say it's impossible. You've got your enemies in Europe, you've got your enemies back in the House of Commons. No one could have brought about Brexit now.
It was a difficult challenge, but Theresa May made it even more difficult by some of the key decisions she made at key points. Firstly, as soon as she entered office, the decision not to tack towards a sort of softer Brexit that could command a majority in the House of Commons. And then second, an attempt to create a majority through a general election that backfired spectacularly. So
she tried to strengthen her hand by calling a snap election, and in fact, she lost seats and weakened her hand. Andre Walker, I put it to you that your industry, the newspapers, Fleet Street as it used to be called, with rather nasty headlines all the way through, very discouraging. Could anyone have sustained Could anyone have sustained the barrage that came from the press?
Well, look, very discouraging is a phrase that you use for a 5-year-old, not not about a British Prime Minister. Look, what's been said is absolutely correct. The first problem that Theresa May had was the loss of the majority in the general election. But also, her negotiation strategy was this, to send Ollie Robbins to agree with Michel Barnier, the maximum they could get away with, and then they would attempt to sell it to the British public. The sequencing was such that, first of all, we had the withdrawal agreement, and then we have the future relationship. That meant that all of our bargaining chips would be given away first before we went to the Europeans to beg for a few scraps off the table.
I ask you this, though. Who really could have walked that tightrope between Westminster and Brussels?
In absolute honesty, Matthew, I'd have been perfectly happy sending my 3-year-old nephew in preference to Ollie Robbins and Theresa May. I genuinely believe, had he scribbled all over the page, he'd have probably done a better job. This was a lamentable negotiation by people who never wanted to leave the EU in the first place, and that's why they've come unstuck.
Scott Lucas, from your perspective, what happened?
Well, I think you've gotten both sides of a bad hand played badly. I think Theresa May made some big mistakes. For example, boxing herself in by saying no deal is better than a bad deal. But I think you've also got the difficulties, and Andre's pointed it out, because that's the hard Brexit view of Theresa May, that she should have gone in and shaken her fist at the EU instead of sending her staff over there to negotiate. The fundamental is that any agreement with Europe was going to have something close to a customs union, a trading relationship, and it was going to have security for Ireland and Northern Ireland. And you cannot get that with a hard Brexit point of view. So Theresa May was caught between them and between the idea that we have to walk back the entire process because of the risk of economic damage if we crash out of the European Union.
You think it should have been softer? Your president, back in the White House, well, he was one of many people lining up to give her advice. And let's have a listen and to her reaction.
I did give her a certain amount of... I gave her a suggestion, not advice. I wouldn't want to give her advice. I'd give her a suggestion. I could fully understand why she thought it was a little bit tough.
What was that brutal, tough suggestion?
He told me I should sue the EU.
Sue the EU?
Sue the EU. Not go into negotiations, sue them. Actually, no. We're going into negotiations with them. But interestingly, what the president also said at that press conference was don't walk away.
Yeah.
Don't walk away from the negotiations because then you're stuck.
Back to Scott Lucas now, big fan of Donald Trump, obviously. Why didn't she just sue the EU? Game over.
Because if you see the EU game over, that in effect is we're taking our ball and going home, but taking our ball from a weak position. Look, the UK could have walked out of the negotiations with the EU at any point over the past 3 years. But if you choose to do that, you're on your own, not only versus the 27, but versus the global economy. At the very least, even a Brexit, which can be agreed with a deal, probably on everyone's estimates, all economists' estimates, is a 4 to 5% hit on GDP. But if you just step away from the EU, you're talking about a 10% relative drop in GDP. And any successor to Theresa May is still going to face that fundamental economic reality.
Alan pretty much agrees with you. So I'll come to you, Andre. What do you think?
Well, look, it's absolute nonsense to suggest that we need to be shackled to the corpse that is the European Union. It is the only region in the world who has seen no real economic growth. And look, the most important bit is your ability to be able to set your own trade tariffs. I personally advocate setting those tariffs at zero. And people always say, look, we need to protect our markets. We must put tariffs on foreign olive oil and foreign oranges. I say, hey, let's create a free market. Britain was made rich from the free market. We were not made rich by big government socialism and by big government tariffs
Alan,
on everything.
A final question on this, Alan. Look, basically what they're saying is you should never have taken no deal off the table. You should have been prepared to walk away. This is the final question on this, then we'll move on. What do you think?
Well, I think one of the Theresa May's failures was that phrase, no deal is better than a bad deal, because quite frankly, it wasn't a phrase that she believed. So she needed to have that sort of political honesty and that political strength at the start of her leadership to say, look, any no deal will mean we have to ultimately go back to the negotiating table with the EU. Later, it's not possible to have this clean break with the European Union. She didn't feel she was able to do that because she was a Remainer fighting for leaving the European Union, and that was her big failing, I think.
Always a difficult position for her. Alan, thank you. Now, it's clear that she failed to deliver Brexit, sometimes called Britain's greatest challenge since the Second World War. But does that make her Britain's worst ever Prime Minister? The leader of the Brexit Party certainly thinks so.
I just would like to see a Prime Minister that actually believed in Brexit and believed in what they were doing.
If the Prime Minister had any sense of honour, she would resign.
Oh, she has. You can hear the vitriol in his voice, can't you? But is Nigel Farage and others just hamming it up? Or do they actually have a point? Surely there have been worse PMs. 300 years, 54 Prime Ministers, and Theresa May is the worst. Really? Scholars usually put Lord North at the bottom. He's the one who lost America. But worst in modern times, you know, since the end of World War II, maybe. But she has got stiff competition. British scholars recently came up with this top 5 worst PM list. At 5, the man who took Britain into the European community, Ted Heath. A 3-day working week, soaring unemployment and battles with trade unions. He called a snap election asking, who governs Britain? The answer was, not you. At 4, the only Labour leader on the list, Gordon Brown. He waited a decade for Tony Blair to hand him the keys to number 10. When he finally got them in 2007, boom, the Great Global Recession. He lost the keys just 3 years later to number 3, David Cameron. He promised a Brexit referendum, he held a Brexit referendum, and he lost the Brexit referendum.
The country requires fresh leadership.
Cameron promptly quit and handed the poison chalice to his successor. At number 2, the aristocratic Alec Douglas Hume. A terribly ill Harold Macmillan essentially appointed him his successor, a move compared to Caligula appointing his horse as a consul. It didn't sit well with the party, nor the country, and he lost the election the following year. And finally, at number 1, Anthony Eden. The skilled diplomat ruined his reputation by staging military action with France and Israel to punish Egypt's Abdel Nasser for nationalising the Suez Canal. Without US backing, Britain failed and had to accept it was no longer a world superpower. Right, for the eagle-eyed amongst you, you'll notice Scott's gone. We lost the signal, but we still have Andre and Alan. Let me start with you, Alan. Of all the prime ministers since World War II, people say that she's the worst. Your ranking?
Well, she must be up there in terms of her political communication skills and in terms of her political campaigning skills. But as a prime minister, in terms of the decisions she had to make, she was faced with an insurmountable, potentially, challenge because of her predecessor, David Cameron, who went into the referendum without planning for it, without engaging with planning for it. So he probably has to come out as a worse prime minister in terms of governing than Theresa May.
Even than Eden?
Well, Eden was faced with a similar difficulty to Theresa May in that he was facing a Britain that was losing its global power and was unable to understand its global position in a coherent way. So he went to the Suez crisis thinking that Britain was still a top global player. And so Theresa May went to the EU, maybe not understanding the extent to which the EU held the majority of the cards in the negotiation, given its relative standing in terms of its economy and its trade policy.
So her weak position, you're saying, is really a reflection of the strength of the country. Andre Walker's shaking his head. What do you think, Andre?
Well, it's nonsense, isn't it? Look, the idea that big government equals power is something that is demonstrably not true. Theresa May fundamentally is somebody that believes in the EU as a marvellous institution. She believes that trade is something that governments create, not created by the private sector. And that's what put her in such a weak position. Because fundamentally what she did in the negotiations was she said to herself, how little of the European Union can we leave and get away with it? Now, in terms of the worst Prime Minister ever, look, Gordon Brown selling the gold reserve for a quarter of its value, acquiring government debt during the largest boom in British history and creating the financial crisis, or at least making it significantly worse. I think that puts Brown worse than her. But Theresa May is a legendary bad negotiator.
Oh, that's a little harsh, Andre. I mean, it was the subprime mortgage crisis originally that came from the United States that sort of dismantled the whole system.
Yes, but most countries in the world were putting money aside for a rainy day. John Maynard Keynes himself said that what you needed to do was save in the good times and spend in the bad times.
Well, what does that mean in terms of the ranking then? Worse than May, better than May?
Oh, Gordon Brown, without question, was the worst Prime Minister in British history. Theresa May, you know, at least she dealt with some security issues. She was pretty good when it came to the Novichok attack in Salisbury. And also, employment is rising and unemployment's dropping. So she has got some good things to talk about. She's just a terrible negotiator.
But, Alan, there were a number of things, including the Windrush scandal, which was about sort of deporting people from the Caribbean who had been living in this country, in some cases, for decades. And that was a large blot on her record, was it not?
Yeah, and I think it was emblematic of Theresa May as a sort of one-track Prime Minister. The way that she did politics from the Home Office, which was sort of target-driven policy instead of big strategic thinking. And I think that was emblematic in that search for a Brexit policy that could fulfill that 100,000 net target for immigration into the UK, and that transferred into her policy as Prime Minister from her time at the Home Office. And in general, this inability to think bigger picture than sort of the target-driven politics that you have as a senior minister, but as a Prime Minister, it's somewhat different.
A point that you can both agree on, I think. So who's likely to replace her? Let's take a look at that now. And we have something like a dozen wannabes up there for brevity. Let's just consider the top 5. We have Andrea Leadsom, the ex-leader of the House of Commons, Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt, the Environment Secretary Michael Gove, former Brexit Secretary Dominic Raab, and the favourite is, believe it or not, the former Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson.
Are you going to win, Mr Johnson? Are you going to be the next Prime Minister? Do you think he'd do a better job than Mrs May?
Oh, he's always on the move, isn't he? But he's going to have to get used to the attention if he's in Downing Street. Let me come to you, Andre. He says, of course I'm going to go for it. Well, a lot of people would say if you go for it, you've still got the same problem. You're still drinking from the same poison chalice. It'll take your career down too.
Well, no, I think that there is an important difference here. We need somebody now, whichever party or whichever individual it is, who understands why people want Brexit. What was said by Alan before was absolutely right, which was that Theresa May just thought it was all about an immigration target, and she fundamentally misunderstood what Brexit was all about to start with. Whereas somebody like Boris Johnson or Dominic Raab, they understand the need to take back control. They understand the need to reduce the weight of bureaucracy of the government, and they understand the need to be a global trading nation. That's what you need now.
The thing is, Andre, he is now being, I don't know how big a deal this is for you, but he's now being sued for allegedly misleading the public during the Brexit campaign. Of course, he campaigned hard to take the country out of the European Union. They're saying that when he stood in front of that big red bus and said, you know, if we leave the European Union, we could save £350 million per week and spend it on the National Health Service, that was misleading.
Well, but firstly, this is a court action that was brought by a private individual. Nobody sensible believes that it's a good idea. And this private individual, it's been reported in the press today, spent some of the money he'd raised for the court case on living in luxury flats. Look, this guy is a political entrepreneur who, if you donated money to the campaign against Boris Johnson in court, then you probably got ripped off. And I'm very sorry about that. But that doesn't make it a serious
you're referring
suggestion.
to the fact that this case was crowdfunded?
Yeah.
OK.
Absolutely.
You know, people who have worked closely with him, who like him, have said, great guy, very entertaining, but doesn't have that temperament to be the leader of the country, and nor does he have the patience for the details that are required to be leader of the country.
But you need somebody with a vision who is a figurehead. Nobody is claiming that being British Prime Minister involves you, taking every single detail down to the bottom, lowest, most insignificant thing.
Well, I don't know. Margaret Thatcher always read her briefing boxes, and she knew more about it than the ministers. Alan, come in for a second, Alan.
This issue of competence is something that preoccupies MPs in Parliament and Boris Johnson's colleagues more than it does those members of the Conservative Party, those 100,000 or so members that will decide the contest. So if Boris Johnson can get the support of 100 or so MPs, and get to those final two, then he's almost certain to win among the members, 2/3 of whom support a no deal Brexit as soon as possible, with no ifs, no buts. But it's whether or not he can get the support of those MPs in the House of Commons. And what helps him at the moment is the sheer number of candidates that are facing him. It makes it very difficult for any one alternative to emerge among MPs and to get that consensus among parliamentarians.
Quick prediction from both of you then. Alan, who do you see as the next Prime Minister in a couple of months' time?
I think Boris Johnson has to be the runaway leader. One of the key things about Conservative leadership contests is the front runner rarely wins. But I think in this case, Boris Johnson has a lot going for him right now.
Andre, the same. It's going to be Boris Johnson's to lose.
Well, you know that my preference is Nigel Farage, but given that he's not a member of the Conservative Party, I think I'm going to have to say Boris Johnson.
Indeed, but it's a very good point. Nigel Farage cleaned up in the European Parliament elections. He decimated the Conservatives, and of course he took all the seats from his old party, UKIP. He's demanding a seat now at the table, negotiations. Does he deserve one?
Yeah, absolutely. It makes perfect sense. But Nigel Farage is extremely important here, because what he's now saying to the Conservative Party is, we all know what Conservative MPs want. They want a pro-European and Jeremy Hunt-type character. But what Nigel Farage is saying is that unless you elect somebody who is a genuine Brexiteer, then actually you're going to lose your seats at the next general election. And that's why I think Boris will win.
All right, thanks, Andre. Let's change tack for a moment and go to Theresa May's birthplace, sunny Eastbourne, on the south coast of England. It's a strongly Leave area. They're very proud of her, of course, but what do they think about her being brought to tears by Brexit? We sent Hannah to find out.
I know what you're thinking. Is this Ibiza? No, it's Eastbourne, where Mrs May was born. So we've come to find out what the locals think of their local gal.
At the end of the day, she had her heart in the right place and she genuinely wanted the good of the country to come through.
Theresa May has not done such a bad job. She hasn't done a particularly brilliant job, because I voted Leave.
She was given a job to do. She hasn't delivered.
Ever since that vote that split the country, Westminster has seemed at times a bit of a crazy circus, and there has certainly been a few clowns.
She promised us strong and stable leadership through Brexit negotiations, but it's all been a bit of a merry-go-round. No more spinning.
She promised strong and stable. Did she deliver?
She's taken over a job that she didn't really ask for.
No male put themselves up to be the leader through Brexit, so I think she's done all right.
Stable, well, nothing's moved.
Theresa May is the second ever British female Prime Minister after Margaret Thatcher. So how does she measure up to the Iron Lady?
She's had the hardest job. She has. Yes, I wouldn't say there's better, but she's had the hardest job.
Personally, I like Theresa May.
She hasn't had the same chance, has she? It's just been Brexit, Brexit, Brexit.
There's an element of the same grit and determination, but then a woman Prime Minister would have to show that.
She spent the last 2 years going back and forth across the stretch of water trying to get us a Brexit deal. I'm going to see if I can do a better job.
Oh, you could throw off your old coat and jump into the deep blue sea and ride the waves in the darkness.
Well, that was Hannah there enjoying the lovely pebble beaches of Eastbourne. Let's go to Alan first and then quickly to Andre. Alan, do you think the Iron Lady could have done any better? How would she have handled Europe?
I think there's something in the style of negotiations that Margaret Thatcher would have conducted may have been different. It wouldn't necessarily have got her all the way, though. She'd have still been faced with exactly the same difficulties. But remember, Theresa May a couple of years ago was being compared the whole time to the Iron Lady as the new Iron Lady. But it's been the fact of negotiations, the grinding nature of these negotiations, the sort of inevitable sense of gradual failure in these negotiations that's really meant that those comparisons with Margaret Thatcher are very thin now.
Andre, do you think the Iron Lady could have handled things better?
Well, absolutely. What she'd have done was she'd have said, first of all, we are not giving the European Union £38 billion, not for a trade deal, but to negotiate the negotiations for a trade deal. That was crazy. We had no requirement to do it. What she would have said is, hey, we're leaving on the 31st of March or whenever it was, and then after that, we're going to negotiate a trade deal, and we may or we may not give you some money. But the idea that we have no treaty obligation to give the EU anything and then we pony up 38 billion in exchange for nothing is not something she would have accepted. And then, if that had have happened, it would have exposed the fact the EU really, really need the money.
And then she would have sent the Navy into the English Channel. Who knows? Here's a quick soundbite for you to remind you how tough she was.
They're a weak lot, some of them in Europe, you know. Weak, feeble.
Well, ever compromising and diplomatic as ever, Margaret Thatcher. Thank you both for joining us here in the Nexus. Andre Walker and Alan Wager, really appreciate it. And thank you also for watching. Remember, you can see this and all our previous episodes on our YouTube channel. Until next week, though, goodbye.